Welcome, everybody. I hope you're having a great morning. Welcome to Township Tuesday. My name is Maddie. I am an attorney with the Association of Townships, and I will give the presentation today. Sorry, I'm fiddling with my screens here a little bit. Make sure that I can change the slides. Okay. All right. I'll leave some time at the end for questions, but you can certainly put them in the chat. I may not see them right away while I'm presenting, but I'll try to get to them as I see them. But today we're going to be talking about published notices. I hope you guys can see my screen with the, can I just get a nod if you guys can see the public?
We can see the red screen.
Great, awesome.
Yep.
Thanks, Leslie. Okay, so today we're talking about published notices. I've had some questions lately regarding publications, when you can't find a newspaper, things like that. So I just thought I'd go through kind of the basics of publishing notices and what that entails today. All right. So the agenda today, we're going to talk about posted versus published notices, when those are required, when they're not, when to publish notices, what those statutes typically look like, frequency of publication, what that looks like, publishing errors, when those occur, what to do, payment, what those requirements are, what your rights are in terms of how much you have to pay for those publications, terms that mean publication, things you should look out for when you're looking at statutes, and designations of official newspapers, which is the kind of the area where I get a lot of questions. So that's what I saved for the end there. All right, so some statutes require published notice and some statutes require posted notice. For posted notice requirements, town must designate at least one place in town for a public place for which legal notices will be posted. That's just a place where people can walk by, easily accessible, and see these notices posted. Now, a town board doesn't have to publish a regular board meeting or special board meetings unless the specific type of meeting requires published notice. So typically those kinds of meetings aren't required to be published in the newspaper, right? When something says it's posted, that means it's posted on the board where the town has designated. When it says it's published, that typically means published in the local newspaper. A board may waive the posted notice requirements of any law, but then they'll have to publish that notice once a week for 2 successive weeks in that newspaper. So if they don't want to post for whatever reason, they don't have a posting place, you can waive that, but you would then have to publish in the newspaper that your town designates. If the town board would like to give notice for most of their meetings on their website, they can do so as long as they are also providing the proper posted notice for those meetings. So, for example, if the town board is looking to hold a special meeting to discuss whether the town should switch to mail-in balloting, all that's needed is 5 days posted notice. Now, if the town would also like to post on the website, that's okay, but you'll need to post in that posting place. But publishing in the newspaper isn't necessary. Published notice is only required when a statute says it's required. So if you need to publish something in the newspaper, the statute will say it in some way, shape, or form. And I'll go over that in a little bit as well. But townships don't need to publish notice very often. It's not something that occurs very frequently. It can get expensive, so it's kind of nice that we don't have to do it very often. But it will say it explicitly in the statute if it's required. Published notice is most often required when the board is conducting a hearing. So when the public needs to know that they need to take action, right? That they need to be involved in something. Taking action that affects someone's property typically will require publication, or for the annual town meeting, typically towns will want to publish when that's occurring as well. Some examples include road hearings, planning and zoning hearings, elections issues, things like that. All right, so when to publish. So elections is a big one. The town clerk must include language of the questions that are going to be posted for elections. Just want to make sure that There's nothing in the chat. Okay. The town clerk must include language of the elections or the questions published in the elections and how they will appear. They will also want to publish notice of the filing period of offices up for election, and where they must file should be published in the local newspaper at least 2 weeks before the first day to file for affidavits of candidacy. So there's some elections requirements there. Matt also recommends townships publish and post the information for the annual meeting to increase participation in those. Ordinances also must be published in whole or an approved summary in a form of a certain size. The general publication requirements for towns to publish their ordinances is in Minnesota Statute 365.125. So if you want to post it in a way that's a summary rather than the entirety of the ordinance, you'll want to take a look at that statute. Is there a template yet for the earn sick and safe time in the records keeping aspect? We do have a resolution sample for earn sick and safe time on our website. I believe it's under employment, the employment section. But I don't know about the records keeping aspect of it. That was just a question in the chat, sorry. Okay, so meetings also, they don't need to be published. There's no requirement for special or regular meetings to be published under the open meeting law. Other statutes may require publication for use of certain powers, but meetings aren't one of those. Towns aren't also not required to publish their minutes, but the board will want to post its minutes, right? And they can publish the minutes, but they're not required to do that. Some more examples of when you'll have to publish is when you're issuing certificates of indebtedness. If the amount exceeds a certain amount, then the notice must be published. Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Questions for record keeping you'll want to email Lori. She'll have more information regarding those questions. Sealed bidding is another instance where you'll have to publish notice for advertisements of sealed bidding. Those should be placed in the newspaper of general circulation, right? Road contracts is another example. Those can't be let until the plans and specifications for construction are filed with the town clerk and an advertisement is published in a newspaper. Zoning ordinances, a public hearing must be held before zoning ordinances or amendments are adopted. You'll have to give 10 days published notice for that. Livestock production is also an example. To adopt an ordinance regulating livestock production, you'll need published notice. Orderly annexations need published notice once those are adopted as an agreement. And meetings of the Board of Appeals and Equalization, the town clerk will want to give 10 days published notice of those meetings. So those are just some examples of when published notice is required. No, you're not required to post minutes. Sorry, you can post minutes. Okay, frequency. So how often should you be publishing these minutes? A notice to publish will tell you typically how long you should keep that notice available. But if it doesn't, the notice will be published at least once unless they say otherwise. So if the statute says a certain number of weeks a notice is required, the notice must be published once a week for the number of weeks specified. If it says 3 weeks, then that's once a week for however many weeks. When the statute states successive weeks of notice, at least 5 days must be between each publication. And at least the publication must be available for at least the weeks specified in the successive weeks within the statute. Occasionally, the statute will specify a certain number of days between the last publication and the event. For example, publications for road bids must be published for 2 weeks. 2 successive weeks, with the last publication to be made 10 days before awarding the contract. So sometimes they'll give really specific information. Yeah, so is a requirement for road contracts publishing for all projects regardless of contract value. So that's that has to do with road contracts specifically. Those are road contract requirements. That's separate from municipal contracting law. So that's regardless of value. Okay, for publishing errors. All right, if you come across a situation, oops, I missed this slide, sorry. So this talks a little bit more, occasionally the statutes will specify a certain number of days that must elapse between the event. We talked about that a little bit, right? But then if the statute doesn't specify a certain time, then the notice intending to inform the public about the future event or the last publication must occur not 30 days less than the event and 7 days before the event. So there's a time frame there. For notices to inform the public about past actions, the publication can't occur more than 45 days after the event. So you want to make sure you keep track of that. Will your presentation be kept on the MAT website for future reference? Yes, these Township Tuesday presentations are kept on the website. We also have a YouTube page that you can go back and watch these on YouTube as well. So those are available on YouTube. All right, so now publishing errors. Sorry about that. Okay, publishing errors. So sometimes the newspapers make a mistake, they screw up, and they don't publish your notice, and there's some concern there, right? But an error in publication caused by the publisher does not invalidate the actions taken at your meeting. So it doesn't invalidate the township's actions. If through no fault of the town an error occurs in the publication, it will have no effect on the validity of the event. So you don't have to worry if it wasn't your fault. To take advantage of this protection, the town clerk should at least keep a copy of all notices presented to the paper for publication. A copy of the posted notice supported by the affidavit of posting corresponding to the publishing notice will serve as kind of the record of what was presented to the paper and why they made a mistake. The newspaper must give a town an affidavit of publication telling them all of the information before the paper can be compensated for the publication. So if you don't receive an affidavit of publication from your newspaper, then they cannot be compensated for those publications. It basically means, these statutes basically mean that if the town made an effort to publish a notice, but there are errors in the publication, it doesn't invalidate your actions or create any liability for the township. All right, payment. That moves us on to payment. The maximum rate a newspaper can charge for a publication is controlled by Minnesota Statute 331A.06, subdivision 1. That's where that's located. And it basically says that they can't charge you more than what they would charge a regular customer. So if there's deals going on or special coupons or whatever it may be where they are giving their regular customers a deal, they have to give you that deal as well. They can't increase charges just because you guys are a government entity and you're required to do this kind of thing. Now, it doesn't say exactly what that price needs to be, right? But they do say that it needs to be whatever they're charging their regular customers. So the town, again, you guys should be receiving an affidavit of publication as proof that the newspaper published the official notice. You guys will want to withhold payment if you don't receive that. So you want to make sure you receive that. That's really important. All right. So terms that mean publication of public notice, right? Terms that mean terms you'll want to look for in statute that mean you have to publish these things, right? The statutes will say things like a qualified legal newspaper, a legal newspaper, an official newspaper, right? Or just the word newspaper should raise a red flag for you, right? A medium of official of official publication is also a phrase sometimes used in statutes. But anytime you see these kinds of words, a flag should go up and you should think, oh, I have to publish this. This has to be published in our official newspaper. Now, designating an official newspaper is kind of the question that I think I get most often when discussing publications, right? So the town board must designate an official newspaper for the publication of town notices. And the official newspaper must be qualified under the statutes to publish legal notices. That's under Minnesota Statute 331A.04. You guys will want to consider making this designation every year, and you could do it at the reorganization meeting just as a standard procedure, because sometimes these newspapers go out of business or they are no longer in service in your area or things like that. So you just want to make sure you're on top of these proceedings and you're designating a newspaper every year and making sure you know where that should be published. You guys cannot meet your legal publication requirements by only posting notice on a website. Now, sometimes your town's official newspaper, the newspaper that you choose, will have a website of their own. And as a condition of accepting and publishing public notices in the newspaper, they'll agree to post all notices on their website as well. And the Minnesota Newspaper Association statewide public notice website, which is a different website that just gathers all of the public notices for government entities. That's fine, but that's a requirement that the publishers need to worry about, not you guys. You guys just need to make sure that you're accessing a qualified publisher, a qualified publication, in order to make these notice requirements. So you can't just post it on your own website. That would not meet the requirements for published notice. Oops, wrong button. Okay, what is a qualified newspaper? So all public notices generally must be published in a qualified newspaper. When an item is required to be published in a newspaper that's located in a town, no qualified newspaper is located in that town, then the publication must be made in a qualified newspaper that is likely to give notice unless a particular statute provides otherwise. So there is a process of how you should designate a qualified newspaper, who is your official newspaper, and I'll go over that in the next slide here. I know there's a lot of qualifications on this slide as to what is deemed a qualified newspaper. You don't really have to worry about all those qualifications on there. I just put those on there so you guys are aware that they exist. But the Secretary of State's office has created a list of 300 legal newspapers registered with the Minnesota Secretary of State's office. And those are all officially designated publications that have met all of these requirements here on the right. So you can take a look at the Secretary of State's office if you're wondering if your newspaper is deemed a qualified newspaper, because it has met all of the requirements here on the right if it's registered with the Secretary of State's office. So these are all the requirements that they must meet legally, but you guys don't have to worry about that as long as you're finding those registered newspapers on the Secretary of State. So I won't bore you with reading through all those requirements. It basically is just, it has to be printed in English, right? It must be a certain amount of newspaper or news information rather than advertisements. It has to be issued a certain amount of times a year. It's just those kinds of requirements. But again, if you just take a look at the Secretary of State's website, that's an easy way to figure out if your newspaper is deemed qualified to create these publications. All right, so how to choose an official newspaper. There is a step-by-step that you guys are required to kind of follow in order to deem your newspaper your official newspaper. So obviously, all official newspapers must be qualified. They must meet those requirements that I showed on the last slide. But in order to designate an official newspaper in your town, the town board must consider first if the qualified newspaper has its own office of issue in the town. That if you guys have an office of issue in your town, that is the official newspaper of your town, and that shall be designated the official newspaper. That's a requirement. Now, if you don't have an official newspaper that has its office in town, which not many do, right, then the town must designate the qualified newspaper that has a secondary office in town. So if there's not a primary office in town, if any newspaper has a secondary office in town, then that would be the official newspaper that you would use. Now, again, that's not a very common occurrence in townships. So if no qualified newspaper has its office in town, then the qualified newspaper of general circulation in the town shall be designated. Now, that might be something like the Star Tribune or the Pioneer Press or something like that, something that's more widely circulated. And I understand those can be more expensive and more difficult to work with, but that is kind of your third option there if you don't have those designated newspapers within your town. If money is kind of a struggle, it's too expensive to publish in those newspapers, you can speak to those newspapers about maybe not doing it unless you need to meet those requirements, right? Unless, so they aren't publishing too frequently. Otherwise, you could speak to them. You could only publish when you are absolutely required to do so to lessen those prices. But that is kind of the third option that we have. If a newspaper is discontinued in the process of your publication, the publication can be completed in another qualified newspaper, and you'll just continue the time period. So if it's disqualified 2 days after it's published, then you'll still count that time in which it was published in the first newspaper as part of the time that it was required for that publication. So it will still be included if that newspaper is discontinued somehow during your publication. Now, if you absolutely have zero newspapers publishing throughout the town, there are ways to avoid this publication requirement, but you'll want to work with your town attorney to make sure that you have gone through all the steps necessary and there's absolutely no option available that would meet these legal definitions. So typically that lies back on widely circulated newspapers like the Pioneer Press or Star Tribune within Minnesota, right? So typically those are the ones that you'll end up having to use if there's no other options available. But again, take a look at that Secretary of State website. They'll have options for the 300 listed newspapers that are deemed appropriate to use for these published notice requirements. But other than that, that's all I have for you guys today. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, you can email me questions anytime. All right, that's all. I hope you guys have a great afternoon. What if you don't publish something that, Patty, are you talking about if you missed a publication, if you missed publishing something? That you were required to do? So if you miss a publication, if you don't follow procedure, right? There's procedural requirements that's due process. So if somebody has an issue with whatever decision you came to with skipping those steps in the procedure, they could invalidate whatever decision was made if you're skipping a step in the procedure. So you really want to make sure you're following step-by-step procedure when making these choices. You may have to start that procedure over again to ensure that that was done properly, to make sure that nobody can come back and invalidate those choices that you made for avoiding that published notification. Okay, can you address the question of using Zoom and if a supervisor can be considered part of the quorum? So when you're using Zoom in a meeting, there are certain steps you need to take. They need to be seen and they need to be heard. still considered part of the quorum in some circumstances, but they can only do that a certain amount of times per month, I believe. This was enacted during quarantine. There's some requirements that you'll want to meet, but they can only do it a certain amount of times per year, per month. I can't think of it off the top of my head, but they need to be seen and heard in order to be a part of the meeting. So you can't just do it over phone, for sure. And you want to be careful about how often you're doing it. All right. Well, I hope you guys have a wonderful afternoon, a wonderful Tuesday, and I hope to hear from you all soon. Thank you.